Well, it's time now to take a look at a selection of some of today's newspapers from around the world with our press reviewer, Elena Casas. She joins me now. Hello, Elena.
Hello.
Right, so, of course, one big story dominating certainly the British newspapers, but some international ones as well. How is the rest of Fleet Street reacting to that shock closure of one of its own?
Well, we've got some pretty excellent headline writing today, I must say. I think the Telegraph has to take the gold medal with Goodbye Cruel World this morning, but the Independent's new subsidiary I has done quite well. They've got the end of the world on their front page today, and this is even leading Murdoch's very own Times, which starts with hacked to death today. So good news for headline writers, but I think the one which most sums up how Fleet Street has reacted to this is today's Independent, which leads on newspaper sacrificed to save one woman. This sums up the sentiment in Fleet Street pretty well. There's widespread sympathy for those 200 News of the World journalists who've lost their jobs, most of whom didn't work at the paper when most of this phone hacking took place. There's widespread sadness in Fleet Street at the loss of one of their own, Britain's biggest-selling newspaper, which has a 168-year history, and as the Independent points out, a rich journalistic history, despite the fact that they've become notorious now for using questionable means to get their stories. And, of course, there's also anger in most of today's papers that Rebekah Brooks, chief executive of News International and editor during the worst hacking episodes, is still in her job. The Guardian has an interesting piece on their front page called Hacks Pay the Price of Hacking. The paper calls Murdoch's decision to close News of the World breathtakingly cynical. They say Brooks must have known there was something very nasty in the woodshed, even if she didn't personally authorise those hacks. The paper says Andy Coulson is set to be arrested this morning, and they also say that News International is deliberately trying to frame him as the person responsible for the hacking. They point out that News International newspapers, especially The Times, have focused a lot of their coverage of this story on legal payments made by News of the World journalists to the police, which took place during his editorship, and they say that focus is deliberate. They're trying to focus attention on things that happened during his rule rather than hers, so that they can sacrifice Coulson, if you like, in order to save Rebekah Brooks' job.
Okay, so sticking with The Guardian, they also say that this could well spread beyond Britain, this scandal, and infect Mr. Murdoch's American media empire as well.
Yes, they have an interesting article on the international impact of this. They say that the hacking of murder victims and of the families of soldiers killed in Afghanistan has really gripped the attention of the American public, and that means the advertiser boycott that's affected the News of the World could spread to his American titles, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post. Of course, along with Fox News, they're responsible for most of Murdoch's bottom line, so this could really hit him where it hurts if sales of his American papers are affected. A US liberal blog called Media Matters is going to the US Congress with a formal request for them to start an inquiry into whether or not his American papers hacked anybody. They did ask Murdoch this question on camera yesterday, and he refused to answer it, which of course isn't quite the same as a denial, so that's caused lots of online speculation about whether or not the New York Post particularly may also have been phone hacking.
Okay, well, moving back to the UK, the Daily Telegraph they're worried about the outcry and how it might damage the freedom of the press in Britain, perhaps by pushing the government into more regulation.
This is an interesting piece by Andrew Gilligan. He says this could trigger an earthquake which could affect the whole of the British press. Now, he's referring to calls for the government to start a state system of newspaper regulation after the Press Complaints Commission, which is the voluntary system, seems to have failed so spectacularly. Now, he says all newspapers could be tarred with the same brush as the News of the World, and that means the government could restrict everyone's freedom to publish. He points out that phone hacking is already illegal, so there's no need for a change in the law. He says there's just a need for a change in how the police investigate this type of case. He says journalists should be free to make mistakes. Of course, he made a pretty famous one himself, Andrew Gilligan, and he says they should be allowed to make mistakes and own up to them. They're mostly honest mistakes, and it would be a shame if the British government used this as an excuse to try and square some of their old grudges against the tabloid press by regulating them.
Okay, and just very briefly, time for one different story. The last space shuttle flight is expected today. What are the US papers saying about that?
Well, there's a moving piece in the Washington Post calling the cancellation of the space shuttle program an American tragedy. They talk to space fans, some of whom have been camped out for days in Cape Canaveral to get the best vantage point to see that take off, and to former astronauts. One says, now that it's been scrapped, that will be the end of American children dreaming of growing up to be astronauts. It just won't capture the imagination in the same way, he says.
Okay, well, thanks very much indeed, Elena, for that look at all today's international newspapers.